When you receive your weightless quilter, you're going to have 4 corner brackets, and you will also have 4 floor bars. Of course, your floor bars are going to be a lot longer than mine. You'll find a bag of all these different items, and in there, you're going to find 4 fabric clamps, and to open them, you just put your fingers inside that cavity and then press with your thumb or palm. You'll also find 2 bags of pre-cut adhesive felt, paper backed, so you just remove the piece of paper on each one and apply that to your flex poles. So you just remove that adhesive, place it on the end, and then just wrap it around the flex pole. Now your flex poles come in 2 diameters. This is the thicker one. It also has a skinny one. You'll have 4 of the thick and 4 of the thin. The thicker ones are sturdier than the thin ones. The thin ones obviously have more flexibility, and we'll talk about that in a minute. These flex poles go into your corner bracket like so. That felt gives them a nice snug fit. And then on the other end of the flex pole is where you attach your fabric clamp. And that there are 2 different holes on the fabric clamp, a skinny one and a large one to accommodate the 2 different poles. Also in your baggie, you're going to find some finger cots, these little rubber fingers, and you'll position them over the orange grips on each fabric clamp. And that just gives you a smoother, more delicate surface that will touch your quilt sandwich. So I just thought that this was a nice addition to add to the weightless quilter so that those little orange pads, they're kind of rough, and so they don't have to touch your fabric. They're protected by those finger cots. So once you have all of that set up, well, what you're really going to do first is attach your floor bars to your corner brackets. And they go in this fashion. The 2 corner brackets that will be positioned behind the machine, you want the holes positioning away from the machine so that when you add your flex pole, it's pointing away from the machine. In the front of the machine, on the left-hand side, you'll have the corner bracket positioned in the opposite direction so that now the flex pole will be positioned away from the machine. So as you can see, it's spanning away from the machine, both in the back and the front. Of course, your floor bars are going to be larger. They're going to be, on the floor and surrounding the machine or table, your sewing machine furniture. Now, as you attach your quilt and all your flex poles, if you find that you have any lift at all, you can add another floor bar here to create a weight, or you can add a bag of beans or a bean bag in this area if you have any lifting. It happens very rarely, and frankly, when I'm quilting, I pay attention to what's happening up on the hoop. Once my weightless quilter is on the floor, I don't pay any more attention to it because I'm focusing on the quilting. So what do you do about these poles? In the box, you're going to find 8 poles. 4 are of the thicker diameter, and the other 4 are the skinny diameter. You will find 3 poles that are about 58 inches in height and of each diameter, and 1 pole of each diameter that are shorter. And I always put the short flex pole in front of the machine and the taller flex poles behind the machine. Now, you may find for your setup, if you have your machine at a sit-down height, you may want to cut some of the length off the tall poles. I've never really had a problem with any of the height of these poles. If I'm using a machine that's set at counter height, then I will probably always use the tall poles. If I'm always set at a sit-down height, then I may want a combination of tall poles in the back, short pole in the front, or possibly cutting down maybe 4 or 5 inches off of the taller poles to use in the back. And they're easy to cut. In fact, you can use a steak knife or a small hacksaw. It's not necessary, but you may find to customize it for your needs just makes you more comfortable. To cut the flex pole, I have either a household hacksaw or literally a very inexpensive serrated steak knife. So I've clamped it, actually using my pressing station to hold it in place. And then, you're just going to slice. And you're just going to cut right through there. I would start by taking off 2, maybe 3 inches at a time. Put your fabric clamp back on and see if that's the right position that you like. So it's as easy as just cutting right through that until it separates from the body of the flex pole. I've already attached the bottom of my monster hoop to my machine, and I have my embroidery design selected on the machine. My quilt has been pin basted, so it's all ready to be quilted. So to attach it to the Weightless Quilter, the best way to do this is to open it up, and we have to feed it underneath the foot in this fashion. So just kind of press down all 3 layers so that you can clear the foot. And now I'm going to walk behind the machine or just access these flex poles that are in the back of the machine. And you're going to start embroidering in the center of the quilt. So we just want to get this attached to those fabric clamps in the back. And now I can kind of concentrate on the sewing field that is going to be positioned right under the needle. And I have a template in place. I have a lot of excess fabric here in the foreground. So my flex poles that I have are the skinny flex poles, and they have the most flexibility. So I'll go ahead and clamp that left corner, and I'm also using skinny poles in the back. You'll test it out, and you'll make the right choice for the weight of your quilt and possibly the size of your quilt. So now that it's attached to the Weightless Quilter, I can take the time to center that template underneath the foot and position that the magnetic top right in place. I can feel it with my hands to make sure it's aligned. Now you'll see that, it's not completely flat in the hoop. So I just take a moment and pull and tug on that fabric to make sure it is all flat in the hoop. You can use your editing features in the machine to move the hoop so that the needle is positioned over your template. And you'll do this for every hooping. So, you most certainly want to work with a template and make sure that you are centered in the hoop. Now, some key points that you can use. Seams are great guidelines to ensure that you are straight in the hoop. Like the sashing meets this small block at the 3.5-inch mark on the hoop at the bottom and also at the top. But if it didn't, I could just lift that back part of the hoop and pull the fabric over, and then it's positioned just perfectly. Once I'm satisfied with that, I can peel back my template, just store it here on the quilt, and then lower that presser foot and stitch my design. Now you can see how the quilt all moves with the hoop. As the hoop moves, so does the quilt, and that's the beauty of the Weightless Quilter. It just sways as it holds all the bulk of the quilt and just allows the needle to travel in the sewing field. Just keep stitching and keep quilting. Now you might notice that I don't have a hoop guard attached, which in a different setting, I could be concerned about this roll falling into the sewing field. So after this design stops, I'm going to get a hoop guard and attach that right here to the hoop as we advance to the next hooping. So now that my design has finished, I'm going to lift that top frame, and I can just slide it right off of the machine and attach that hoop guard. It just attaches right to the side. Now to advance the fabric, I'm going to store that frame over the head of the machine. And I can do that while I concentrate on repositioning the fabric for the next sewing area. So it's best to do this, you know, with your template in place. Position the template in the next location, and then just center that needle right over that template. Drop that frame back in place. Smooth out the fabric. And if you have to do any fine tuning on the navigation, use your editing features on the machine. Otherwise, remove the template and stitch that next design. And that will just continue to stitch, and you'll do this over the entire quilt. Now we start in the center and we work about a third, whether that's a third horizontally or a third vertically. That's your choice. There's really no right or wrong. It may depend on what type of design you're doing, your comfort zone, or, you know, whatever you decide. But once you have that complete, that area, then you may have to reposition the weightless quilter. So I'll do that next. I'll move and advance the fabric if I was down here in the lower right corner, so you can see how I would change how it's attached to the weightless quilter. Now that I've repositioned my fabric for this lower right-hand corner, you'll notice that the weightless quilter, there's a lot of kind of drag back here. So I will unclamp the quilt and reclamp it with a portion of it hanging behind the quilt. You don't have to just clamp the corners. You can clamp different portions of the quilt. So in this instance, I'm going to let some of this excess drop on the left-hand side and capture it like that. Now, if you feel there's too much drag here, although we have a lot of flexibility, but I want to most certainly keep my eye on this. We don't want this to happen. And I would not put another hoop guard on the machine. So I can release this and maybe pull it in this fashion. See how that goes. That might be a little bit better. If that's too much drag, and that's pretty tight there, so maybe I loosen that a little bit. Leave a little bit more slack. We really don't want drag. So I can remove my template. Of course, I would center it, you know, in the right position. And then, but let's just go ahead and watch it stitch. Let's take this safety pin out because we know it's going to get caught on that, right? So as it's stitching, we want to keep an eye on the quilt, make sure that it's still flowing and flexing very softly. We don't want a lot of drag. We don't want strain. That can cause the weightless quilter to lift, you know, one of the floor bars underneath to lift a little bit. It most certainly can also cause the magnetic top frame to slide. And if you're using a standard hoop, it would pop out at that point. So again, you know, the machine's doing all the work for you. The weightless quilter is handling all that bulk. It's your job to make sure that nothing's going to fall into that sewing field. A hoop guard is maintaining that roll that's on the right side of the hoop, but over here on the left, we just got to make sure that this doesn't fall in, and it looks like it's totally under control. So I would be confident to walk away from the machine while it finishes this design. So we're going to assume that we have quilted this whole half of the quilt once this design finishes. And that would even include this lower border, the outer border on the right-hand side. Or you could possibly do the borders at the very end after you've quilted the entire body. That's up to you. And I often do that because for this project, I'm stitching with a white thread, but when I do the border, I will switch to a magenta thread. So instead of rethreading several times, I'll just do all the white, the whole body of the quilt, and then I'll go back and do the border. And they go so fast because, you know, it's just several hoopings down the border, right, left, and top and bottom. It works very quickly. Okay, we're going to assume this is done, and we'll just stop the machine. I'll lift that presser foot. Again, I'm going to rest that frame right over the head of the machine, And now I'm going to release it from the weightless quilter, and we're going to completely remove the quilt from both the weightless quilter and the machine. And we're going to rotate it 180 degrees, just like this. And now the unquilted portion is under the needle. And again, make sure you flatten out that quilt sandwich so that you get all the layers to bypass the foot. And we're just going to start just like we did the other side. We're going to clamp that right edge into the weightless quilter on both the right and left side. But remember, now we're focusing on embroidering from the center to this edge of the quilt now. And so this is about center. And we'll position our template in place. We'll get that right, well, it's really the left part of the quilt, but the front captured in the weightless quilter. And then I'm going to bring my frame back in place, drop it back down, make sure all of this is maintained properly. And then we're going to stitch this next design after I rotate the design 180 degrees on the machine. And I have to do the entire half of the quilt with that design rotated 180, not mirror imaged, but rotated 180. And once I complete this half of the quilt, I'm done.